It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Kurt Lackovic to you, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Cancer Trials Australia. We had a lot of good conversation yesterday that framed and referenced Australia as a world leader in clinical trials. Cancer Trials Australia is an organization that has helped to position Australia as one of the most efficient and collaborative clinical trial ecosystems in the world. Under Kurt's leadership, Cancer Trials Australia has been instrumental in streamlining trial processes, expanding patient access, and building a strong business case for embedding research into care. His work has demonstrated how a coordinated national infrastructure can empower both clinicians and patients while accelerating innovation and improving outcomes. Today, Kurt will share insights from Australia's journey, how the country created a nationally aligned framework for clinical trials, what that means for access and equity, and importantly, what lessons Canada can take from their successes as we consider our own path forward. Please help me welcome Kurt Lackovic.
Good morning, all. Pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Montreal. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to come and speak to you today. My remit was really twofold. Firstly, to explain why Australia is an attractive destination for clinical trials, and secondly, how we help ensure those clinical trials are embedded in practice. I sent my slides through last week. But I went through my notes last night and made a few changes to try and link back to the conversation yesterday. My slides are freely available. I've put quite a bit of detail. The documents and projects that I'm referencing are all included on the slide, so they'll be made available to everybody afterwards. I think it's important to remind ourselves how our clinical trial sector arose, with a deep desire to help people and to treat or cure disease. So this is the key reason why I work in this sector. It's an incredibly collaborative sector that's often visible for me at home in Australia, and it was definitely visible in the room here yesterday. We've come a long way since James Lind developed this first clinical trial protocol in 1747, so it's almost 300 years ago. This is 40 years before the British found Australia. Obviously there are people living in Australia before then. So by the end of the first week, this is essentially the world's first clinical trial protocol, 6 cohorts. By the end of the first week, the sailors in the citrus group were helping the sailors in the other 5 groups. Am I too soft? You hear me in the back? Yep. So by the end of the first week, the sailors in the citrus group were helping the sailors in the other 5 cohorts. So later, scurvy was revealed to be caused by a deficiency in vitamin C, obviously cured by eating vitamin C-rich fruits. Interestingly, sailors who ate rats were also cured of scurvy. So rats actually synthesize their own vitamin C. So if you're ever stuck on a cruise ship and you don't have access to citrus fruits, you know what to do. So Cancer Trials Australia was formed more than 30 years ago, and I think it's really important to note up front, it was a clinician-led partnership with a deep desire to improve treatment options for Australian patients through access to cutting-edge therapies, which really can only happen through clinical trials. It was formed in Melbourne, where I'm based. So six oncologists at 6 different hospitals in Melbourne got together and decided it's not good enough. We can't attract clinical trials into the country as individual hospitals. This is pre-internet 30 years ago. And they weren't very comfortable with the level of administrative support that their hospitals were able to provide for what is quite complex procedures. So it started as 6 hospitals. It's grown to be 35 hospitals and medical research institutes across Australia and New Zealand. The easiest way to think of the organisation is as a site management organisation. We provide back-of-house administration for clinical trials around startup initiation, negotiation of budget and contracts, financial management and so on. We also extend that into education and many of the things we discussed yesterday. How do you help improve your entire trial sector, workforce development, educational events, mentoring programs and so on. This was bound to happen when I'm trying to coordinate two different things. Excuse me, one moment. Oops. There we go. All right. So this is called For Those Who Wait. It's an artistic piece by Indigenous artist Safina Stewart, and it represents our vision to improve patient care by enabling the world's best clinical trials. I commissioned this piece earlier this year as part of our Reconciliation Action Plan. Hangs proudly in our office. It's about 4 metres wide, 1.2 metres high, so it's quite massive. The central fire that you see in the middle here, it embodies community strength. The woven basket around that fire represents safety and belonging. The river that cascades through the image represents healing, and the trees represent wisdom of those who've come before us. The gems and the jewels symbolise resilience and strength, and the eagle bundle, who is the creator spirit for Aboriginal Australian people, embodies collaboration, transparency and ethical action. So this artwork represents the core reasons why Cancer Trials Australia exists and reflects our values of shared purpose, collaboration, integrity, adaptability and compassion. So Australia is a leading destination for clinical trials, particularly early phase clinical trials. We rank number 1 in the world for initiation of all clinical trials per person. We rank number 3 in the world for initiation of total number of phase 1 trials per annum, and also total number of phase 1 cancer trials per annum. And in that case, we're behind both only US and China, which are far larger countries when compared to Australia. Our clinical trial sector is quite valuable to the economy, so it brings in almost $2 billion in revenue, employs about 10,000 people, close to 100,000 Australians participate in clinical trials each year. A whole sector is really required to ensure you've got an effective clinical trial ecosystem. So we're talking about universities, healthcare system, medical research institutes that support that, well-trained staff, promotion activities, high-quality labs, CROs as well. The whole ecosystem is really required. I do think, though, that our system's far from perfect, and I'll try to provide a balanced perspective this morning and include where we're headed next. You can't deliver a presentation nowadays without a reference to AI, so I did ask what ChatGPT-5 thought. Thankfully it agrees. It says that Australia is a standout performer for early phase oncology trials in particular, and it lists some of the key reasons that I'm going to explore with you this morning. I do want to point out there might be a little bit of confirmation bias here because it's referencing a report that I co-authored in May, so I'm not so sure you can really trust it. I've got a few data slides that I'm going to share just to point out where Australia's positioned globally, and I've got some unpublished data that compares Australia to Canada that might be a little bit confronting, but I think the reason that I share it with you is that I hope it will help you get traction with the change that you're seeking. So growth in the number of clinical trials started in Australia across this period from 2015 to 2022 sits second only to China globally, and China had pretty explosive growth over that period, about 9% per annum across those 7 years. China's growth, though, is predominantly within China. They don't conduct their trials outside of China very often. I do think that's going to change at some point soon. The reference to this data is the bottom right-hand slide, a report from MTP Connect in 2024. They've got prior year reports on their website as well. On a per capita basis, Australia tracks about 19 industry-sponsored clinical trials per capita, or per million, and leads the world in that regard. Canada was pretty high in 2022. You're ranked 4th for number of commercial clinical trials per million people. I'll show you some more recent data in a moment. Both countries have, therefore, a similar share of global clinical trials. Australia's population is about 70% of that of Canada's. Before I show you the more recent data, this is the last piece of a little bit more historical data. So from 2012 to 2022, we looked at the evolution of phase 1 cancer clinical trials in Australia, which has been the area that we've probably spent the most effort in attraction of trials and supporting trials. And there's a few reasons for that I'll come back to. So on the top right, you've got about 300% growth in phase 1 oncology clinical trial registrations over that period. In the bottom left, since 2014, what you see is much of the growth has been driven by emerging biopharma. So that's the green line, not large pharma, the orange line. And on the bottom right, since 2015, you see that much of the growth has been driven by Asian or Chinese companies. So that's the blue line running their studies in Australia. And I think these types of insights are important as it guides your strategy development and it helps direct the promotional activities of your clinical trial sector. So what about more recently? I'm going to present 4 slides of unpublished data supplied by IQVIA. And I want to highlight that these 4 slides are not only IQVIA-supported studies. This is all publicly available information that IQVIA has put together. If we focus specifically on oncology, in 2024, the share of global phase 1 oncology clinical trials run in Australia, so that's the left graph, increased to 7%. So again, behind only the US and China, and you see the huge growth in China over that period. So both US and China are about 30% or so currently. For Australia, the phase 1 trials are particularly of interest, right? They require fast startup times. They require fewer patients, which is a little bit easier for a less populous country. On the right-hand side, Australia still ranks highly in terms of a share of all oncology trial phases. That's in part because if a phase 1 trial is run in your country, they're more likely to stay for phase 2 and for phase 3. So another reason why attracting phase 1 trials is incredibly important. On the right-hand side, Canada doesn't make the top 10 if you look at all phases of oncology trials. If we now look at the same data, but focusing in on Canada and Australia only, it's pretty clear that Australia's had significant growth over that period, whereas Canada's probably heading back on that period. So we both had 4% of the global share about 10 years ago. Australia's doubled that share in the last 10 years to be close to 8%, and Canada's halved their share to be down around 2%. Trend's not quite as significant for all phases on the right-hand side, but phase 1 is definitely quite pronounced. The next 2 slides focus more on rare cancers. Same images, same process. So if we drill into rare cancer indications in particular, trends are very similar. Australia still ranks number 3 in the world, behind only the US and China for phase 1 rare oncology clinical trials. And again, on the right-hand side, Australia sits amongst a bunch of countries with Canada not featuring in all phases. And if we zoom in on that data, trends again are very similar for rare cancers across both phase 1 on the left-hand side and all phases on the right-hand side. Of course, it depends a little bit on what your definition of rare cancers are, and I note in IQVIA's most recent report this year, they stated that 74% of all oncology clinical trials now fit their definition of rare cancer clinical trials. So that does reflect the changing nature of clinical trials for oncology. It's my final data slide showing both in Canada and Australia, clinical trials are concentrated in 3 or 4 states in Australia or provinces in Canada, and they're certainly the more populous regions of each country. So on both these charts, the numbers don't represent unique trials. So if a trial was open in 2 states or provinces, it would be counted twice on both of these charts. I also want to note that you can't compare the raw numbers. The Australian data is new trials open in 2022, and the Canadian data was total active trials in 2022. But I think based on this, it's probably pretty safe to conclude that both countries have challenges with the equity of healthcare across large regions, and I'll highlight how decentralised or teletrials might have a role to assist with that a little bit later. So why is Australia an attractive destination for clinical trials? So it comes down to 3 key reasons around speed, quality, and cost, and I'll delve into each of those in a little bit more detail on subsequent slides. There's some other key reasons there though. The quality of engagement with our clinician researchers, the oncology of standard of care being quite comparable to the USA, which is generally the market most biotechs are chasing. We've got quite a diverse patient population, similar here, high immigration, largely genetic heterogeneity, which is important. And we've got a really collaborative clinical trial sector, and it appears to be the case that you have the same here in Canada. And we are very effective at promoting that internationally, and I'll come back to that later. We've also got vocal industry bodies which help ensure continued reform, and I want to tie that back into yesterday and actually to some of the comments Barry made this morning, the importance of having that one plan and everybody getting behind it. If you don't have one plan and you've got different organisations going to government with different suggestions, government it just gets lost in the noise. So you need to be very, very coordinated. If we start with speed, Australia's got a very efficient regulatory process. So we have a process called the Clinical Trial Notification Scheme, or the CTN. So our version of the FDA, the TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, offers this streamlined process to help attract early stage research. The vast majority of clinical trials are approved by a hospital ethics committee, so that allows for faster initiation than in many other countries. We've got national mutual acceptance of ethics approval, and we've had that since 2013, but I will circle back to it. It took quite a long time to put that in place. I'll come back to that in a subsequent slide. Early phase studies in Australia don't require an IND. GMP-like material is sufficient for phase 1 studies, and we've got both public and private ethics committees, service both public and private hospitals. I also wanted to note, based on the discussion yesterday, that we have a set of Australian-wide clinical trial research agreement templates. So they've been mandated for all trial sponsors since 2007, so that's almost 20 years. So there's a set of 5 of them. They're publicly available. You can download them, and they deal with both investigator-initiated, cooperative group trials, and obviously commercially sponsored trials. They were developed largely by Medicines Australia, which is the industry lobby body for large pharma in Australia. Obviously, they did that in partnership with the rest of the sector. They needed to have agreement to implement those, but it certainly speeds up essentially the contract negotiation process. There is no negotiation. It's really just around budget. Budgets are, of course, still hotly negotiated. We did have some efforts to try to harmonise costs that failed dismally, and I'm not sure I see value in trying to harmonise costs, to be honest. We can circle back to that in question time. So the hallmarks of the CTN scheme really are that a Human Research Ethics Committee reviews the scientific validity of the trial design, balancing risk versus harm of the therapeutic good, the ethical acceptability of the trial process, and approves the trial protocol. The HREC is also responsible for monitoring the conduct of the trial. The institution or the organisation where the trial is conducted is then referred to as the approving authority, and it provides the final approval for the conduct of the trial at that site, having due regard to advice from the HREC. It's the responsibility of the trial sponsor to ensure that all relevant approvals are in place before supplying the new therapeutic, and the trial sponsor also has to notify our TGA to seek approval to provide that unapproved therapeutic. There are some exceptions, so Class 4 biologics, for example, follow a slightly different process that does require TGA approval, so higher risk items, unless there's evidence, clinical evidence of their use from somewhere else around the world. So what does speed look like? So the problem with putting slides together and sending them through a week in advance is sometimes the data changes. Last week, Oscar Piastri was leading the Formula One World Championship, and that's not the case anymore. He's still well ahead of Lance Stroll, though. So we'll see what happens over the subsequent 4 races. But it's quite nice to have an Australian leading the F1. He's from Melbourne as well, and I got the chance to walk around the Montreal F1 track on Monday, which was fantastic. Unfortunately, I couldn't get agreement from any of the large pharma or CROs to provide some, put their name to the timeline data that I'm going to share. But large pharma will share that with you in confidence, and I think you should use that to your advantage, because large pharma not only work in Canada, they work all around the world, and they will show you where you compare, and they will tell you exactly what they think the barriers are to improving the situation in your country and what you should work on it. So I think you should definitely leverage that. So one large pharma reported that Australia was the second fastest country in the world to initiate clinical trials in 2024. The same large pharma had Canada 4th. Both Australia and Canada have consistently been in the top 7 for timelines in the last 3 years for this large pharma. Of course, it depends what the large pharma focuses on. Are they focusing on later stage trials? What proportion of cancer and so on? So you really have to take the data with a little bit of grain of salt, but the data's there. Go and ask for it. They will happily share it with you. I mean, we heard yesterday from a GSK representative, and I think what I took from that conversation is exactly the same in Australia. Essentially, the local representatives of large pharma want to help you attract more trials to the country, and it's in their interest to do so. So they will share this data with you and work with you on what the barriers are to bringing those trials in, and they're quite effective at doing that. I think you should leverage that. If you're interested in Formula One, on the left, 1966, Jack Brabham was the last Australian World Championship winner, and on the right, you've got the last Canadian one from 1997, I think it was. I mentioned national mutual acceptance before and that it was a slow process. So here's some timelines associated with that. So in 2007, we had a national statement on ethical conduct in human research with aims to reduce duplication in human research ethical review. 2 years later, we had streamlined ethical review for clinical trials implemented in some states of Australia. A year later, we had a national certification scheme for those HREC committees. In 2013, we implemented national mutual acceptance across 4 states, but it was limited to clinical trials. 2 years later, that was expanded to all human research. In 2016, another state joined national mutual acceptance. In 2017, another state. And in 2021, 2 more states joined this process. So you can see it was quite a while to implement this. So I don't think you need to do it all at once. You could start with a couple of states, demonstrate value, and then expand that. We still have some differences, particularly because we have both a public and private healthcare system in Australia. Most trials, especially early phase oncology trials, are run in a public setting. In a private setting, there are private HRECs as well that are very, very efficient and therefore very attractive to initiate trials too. Quality was the second important factor that I listed, and it really comes down to world-class research infrastructure. So we've got state-of-the-art clinical trial facilities that have been invested in over a long period, experienced CROs, both local and international, state-of-the-art healthy participant trial centres, so there are a number of those in most states. We adhere to international guidelines and standards, which obviously means the data is then accepted globally. We're regularly subjected to FDA audits. We've got a well-trained and experienced workforce. We touched on this yesterday, and Barry again talked about how roles might need to change. Part of that comes down to how we provide education. So we have an Australian Clinical Trial Education Centre, so an online platform that provides training to site-based staff. It's a national platform and it continues to grow, and I think one thing perhaps we can discuss after this conference is how Canada might be able to leverage that platform. We've also recently implemented a national clinical trial governance framework, so that came in 2 years ago. Brings me to the next slide. So implemented in 2022. Really the aim of this was to help integrate clinical trials into routine health service provision safely, ethically and effectively. The key components include a detailed list of safety and quality standards, an assessment and accreditation process, implementation support and self-assessment tools. So our hospitals undergo an accreditation process on a 3-year basis. Prior to 2022, the clinical trial units weren't part of that accreditation process. So now they form part of this process. I've included some examples of accreditation standards and the maturity scale that they're assessed against here with no intention of going through them. I just thought they could be helpful resources. I think one of the main objectives with a formal accreditation process of clinical trial units is that it forces hospital executives to pay attention. And again, we talked about this yesterday, having metrics for hospital executives is important. So clinical trials are a pretty small part of most hospitals' overall budget and workload. They're really focused on treating patients that come through the door. By putting this on the agenda, really we've got hospital CEOs that have to pay attention. And so this accreditation process is essentially one mechanism that we have to help ensure clinical research is understood by hospital executives and therefore considered as part of their strategy. So cost is the third important factor, which in Australia's case is largely driven by a very attractive research and development tax incentive. So this was designed to help innovate and grow by offsetting the costs of eligible research and development. It helps attract investment into Australia. Companies can claim up to 43.5% of eligible research and development expenditure as a refundable tax offset. And thankfully, research and development is included, clinical trials is included in the definition of research and development. And the sector had to lobby quite hard to have clinical trials included and to keep clinical trials included when those are up for review. There are some limits based on size of company revenue, but it's particularly attractive for smaller biotechs or pre-revenue biotech. And as I mentioned, the vocal industry bodies really help ensure this remains in place. There was discussion on infrastructure funding yesterday. So our federal government provides 15% in infrastructure funding to universities for any commercial contracts that universities have. So most of the public hospitals in Australia will have a relationship with a university, and if they're clever, they will route their clinical trial funding through the university, therefore attract 15% in infrastructure funding. So an increasing number of those are undertaking that process. So a few other benefits. Australia's got some foreign exchange rate advantages compared to the US. Of course, speed reduces cost to market, which is a big cost saving for companies as well. There's been quite a bit of data published on comparing Australian costs to US. So typically we're about 30% cheaper than the US and 60% if companies are accessing this R&D tax incentive. So it's a significant saving and makes Australia quite attractive. Now, federal and state governments also recognise the importance of clinical trials as both an economic driver and a treatment option for patients. So they continue to invest in medical research, including working to attract large biotech to establish a presence in Australia, build cell and gene therapy manufacturing facilities, which was touched on here yesterday as well, and support biotech incubators. So there's a few examples here of recent investments. In order for this to happen, both our Department of Health and our Department of Trade and Innovation really need to work closely together, and they have quite an open dialogue about clinical trials. I think it's really important because clinical trials obviously bring new novel therapies to patients, but also bring significant investment into the country. So being able to leverage those arguments is particularly important. There's not much point having an attractive clinical trial ecosystem if nobody knows about it globally. I think the Australian ecosystem partners have been really effective in promoting their capabilities over the last 10 years. So being a cohesive group of individuals that go out and promote the country as a whole and grow the pie for all has been really important, rather than distinct states going out and talking about their capabilities, which really just confuses people, to be honest. They don't know much about Australia. It's probably the same for Canada if you're speaking to a South Korean or a Chinese or a Japanese biotech. You really need to present a really strong, well-articulated, consistent story for the country. I mentioned the governments have been, both state and federal, have been quite supportive for a long time. I think our clinicians have been really effective at getting out and presenting and chairing at major international meetings, and they're often overrepresented for the size of Australia. My boss, so the board chairperson, heads up early drug development at Peter Mac, and he was recently chairing the AACR clinical trial stream. It's the first time someone outside of North America co-chaired that stream. So it's great to see that. And I guess it speaks to, again, the engagement in the early phase trial space, often first patients on globally or at Australian hospitals, which leads to publications and presentations and so on, again, raising the research bar. So the left image on this slide is the Australian contingent at Bio in Boston this year. So about 400 people from life sciences in Australia that went to Bio together, having the one Australian stand supported by the Australian government to do that. On the right-hand side, that's me a few years ago with the former Premier of the state of Victoria. So again, you know, both sides of government actually have been very supportive of clinical trials for a long time. And just last week, Austrade, so our Trade and Investment Department, announced a renewed focus on promoting our clinical trials internationally. So 25 events planned for 15 countries over the next 10 months. So that's the type of investment that goes into promoting this internationally. I talked about Australian clinicians being overrepresented at major international meetings like ASCO and ASH, and mentioned my board chair at AACR. I think you can also leverage collaborations. So I put one here that I could find quite quickly, but there are definitely collaborations between high-profile Australian hospitals and high-profile Canadian hospitals. I assume they extend to clinical trials, and I think you could certainly explore how they could be leveraged a little bit further. We also talked about fellowships last night. There are a lot of Australian clinicians who head overseas for fellowships, bring that experience home. I'm not sure if that's the case for Canadians. It seemed to be not as popular here. I think that's really good to establish international links. So it's something you should think about if it's not something that Canadian clinicians generally undertake. So we still have challenges. We've got a target on our backs now. We've been promoting this for quite some time, and others have started taking notice. We've got the FDA reaching out to try and understand our processes because they would like to be a little bit quicker, even if they've got their own political challenges at the moment. At the Bio meeting this year in one of the plenaries, the Bio CEO really highlighted Australian strengths, had the EU Commissioner on there and asked him what he was doing in response to that. So we have to be careful, and we'll come back to continuing to innovate in a moment. We have many challenges that are similar to Canada, so equity and inclusivity. That's partly geography related. Patient recruitment is more challenging in a less populous country. We've got a federated government with hospital care delivered by state governments as well. Our system might not be quite as disjointed as your system, but it still has its challenges. And I'll come back to this IG-PRG in a moment. We're also quite slow between drug approval and patient reimbursement, so the HTA process, and that's definitely a barrier, particularly for latter phase trials for large pharma, because they're often wanting to get into market as quickly as possible. We've been really slow, just chatting earlier this morning, we've been really slow to advance decentralised or teletrials, despite recruiting the world's first phase 1 cancer teletrial patient in Melbourne and the world's first time in human cancer teletrial patient in Melbourne. Those teletrials have been few and far between. I think there's a number of reasons for that. The level of maturity is a bit different between the states in Australia, and I think teletrials have been rather effective with non-commercially sponsored research, but pharmaceutical companies have been pretty slow to consider the model. And really, we need that to change. We need commercially sponsored teletrials if this is going to be a success. So at the moment, there are opportunities for some trial visits to be conducted at home, and you have to think rural and regional hospitals may not have the same capability to conduct all elements, particularly of an early phase clinical trial, but it's quite advantageous if some visits could be conducted closer to home, reduce their travel, reduce their cost, have them closer to their families. So this is certainly being worked on. There's a lot of collaboration in this space. The models are well understood. It's actually how we operationalise those models that's become challenging. A lot of resources are available to assist, and I'll provide some references to those as well. I did want to highlight a recent positive example. So we've had a global large pharmaceutical company agree to a just-in-time teletrial model where pre-screening can occur at a regional hospital. The first 2 trial cycles then occur at a major metropolitan hospital, and that's due to the requirement of a PK sampling being on quite a regular time points, which wasn't possible at this specific regional hospital. But from the 3rd cycle onwards, the patients can be treated at their local hospital. So that's particularly advantageous. We know trial patients are more likely to join up to a clinical trial and remain on a clinical trial if they can access most of their visits closer to home. This process really helps reduce inequity, enhances participation, and the sponsor covered the costs of the regional hospital startup, even though the trial won't actually open until the 3rd cycle. Probably comes as no surprise to this audience that age expectancy is dependent on residential location. So this image shows the median age of death across Australia, with the larger capital cities being 80 to 87 years and the rural regional areas in the 43 to 70 year range, which is a fairly huge disparity. The Australian Teletrial program has $75 million in federal government funding over 5 years to help bring those clinical trials closer to home for patients. It's not cancer specific, this is all clinical trials. You can see there's no data in New South Wales. There's a big gap of one state. They didn't want to participate in this program, so their data's not represented here. So again, that comes back to the federal healthcare model, which is not too dissimilar here in Canada. The aims of this program really are to improve access to and participation in clinical trials for rural, regional and remote Australians, and funding for both the development of shared resources and key staff positions is what it's focused on. Teletrials, or clinical trials, are actually complex, and teletrials adds another layer of complexity. So roles need to be agreed between the lead and the satellite sites, budgets need to be agreed by additional parties, sponsors need to be comfortable, data needs to be managed between sites and so on. So there are now significant resources available to support sponsors and help convince them of the merits of this model and help sites establish them, and I've listed some of those here. And progress has been pretty slow with decentralised cancer clinical trials and also limited by those regional site capabilities, particularly for early phase oncology trials. All right, I'm going to shift gears a little bit to from Australia's attractiveness as a clinical trial destination to how we embed clinical trials in practice. So clinical trials have come a long way since this 2002 Time magazine cover. So that issue went on to highlight some terrible examples of unethical practices, really from across the globe, mostly from the 1930s to 1970s, and Rebecca gave us an example yesterday. Nowadays, it's pretty hard to imagine an industry that's more tightly regulated than the clinical trial industry. I think there are a number of ways we help embed clinical trials into practice, but how did it start? I think it really came down to aspirational clinicians and research staff working closely together over 30 years to help ensure this. So a really collaborative environment where all elements are essential in ensuring an effective clinical trial ecosystem. We've got a culture of not considering clinical trials experimental, and this is always imparted on new doctors as they come through their training process. We've got effective mechanisms to help operationalise clinical trials, so reduce that administrative burden. Cancer Trials Australia is one example, but there are other disease-specific cooperative groups as well. We've got a strong healthcare system, so this was just taking the very first Google rank. If I search for global ranking of healthcare, Australia come up as number 3 and Canada as number 4. I'm sure there are other ways, and obviously it depends how you assess your healthcare system. But this one certainly highlighted that Australia had consistent high-quality infrastructure and government readiness, and that Canada, despite debates over wait times, maintains an excellence in medical infrastructure and governance. I'm not sure if you agree, but I think we both have fairly high-quality healthcare systems. We can agree on that. The main policy framework that guides the provision of access to health technologies in Australia is our National Medicines Policy, and this policy has 3 key aims. So firstly, to provide equitable, timely, safe and affordable access to high quality and reliable supply of medicines and medicine-related services for all Australians. Secondly, to ensure they're used safely, optimally and judiciously with a focus on informed choice and well-coordinated person-centred care. And then finally, to support a positive and sustainable policy environment which drives world-class innovation and research, including translational research and the successful development of medicines and medicine-related services within Australia. We have a nationally consistent guidelines helping to ensure a predictable operating environment in Australia, which also provides international trial sponsors with confidence. So these operating procedures have been agreed to by all states and territories, so they're applied across the country, and they really help provide guidance to everybody involved in clinical trials. There are also separate principles for teletrials agreed across the country, and compliance with these national SOPs and principles really help ensure the public that rights, safety and well-being of participants of clinical trials are protected, and the data generated is secure, robust and credible, and therefore acceptable globally. Medicare is Australia's universal healthcare insurance scheme. It's funded by Australian taxpayers. It covers any services delivered by doctors, specialists and other health professionals, including hospital treatment, prescription medicines if they're covered by the pharmaceutical benefit scheme that I'll cover on the next slide, mental health care, test scans, preventative screening programs and so on. Unlike Canada's universal healthcare, this system is truly national, so what's paid for in one state is exactly the same in all other states. This is done at a federal level. And the same is true of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So this has been running for over 80 years now. It started as a scheme to provide free medicines to pensioners and 139 life-saving and disease-preventing medicines free of charge to all Australians. Nowadays, there's over 900 medicines that are covered by this scheme. It's truly national again. So once again, it doesn't matter where you live within the country. You are covered in exactly the same way between all states. Today, the amount of national income that Australia spends on our net pharmaceutical benefit scheme, so this is the net PBS to GDP ratio, is lower than when this report first came out in 2002. And that's despite a significant increase in the cost of medicine subsidised by our PBS. So on the right-hand side, I've given some examples. Back in 2010, the most expensive medicine that was reimbursed was $24,000. And that's steadily grown to $2.5 million right now, and that speaks to some of the more advanced therapies that we now have and the direction clinical trials has headed over recent years and will continue to head. For clinical trials undertaken within Australia, Medicare really covers the costs of all procedures and tests that would have normally been required as part of standard of care, so it's a little bit advantageous that that's done across the entire country, that there aren't differences between the states. PBS covers the costs of treatments for that disease, with the trial sponsor just contributing a small co-payment. And we have a national approach to negotiating pharmaceutical pricing that's really quite cost effective. Trump's highlighted that recently as something that he doesn't really like, because obviously it's a bit of a disincentive, I guess, to large American corporations, but our government's been very effective at negotiating pricing for pharmaceuticals for a long time. And trial sponsors are really only responsible for paying any non-standard of care procedures and therapies, so again, that helps with the cost effectiveness of running trials in Australia. It's a little bit different in our neighbours, New Zealand. So standard of care in New Zealand is not comparable to what's on offer in Australia. We've had oncologists and haematologists pen their thoughts openly about this over recent years. It gives Australia and New Zealand, I guess, some distinctions between clinical trials. So one of the advantages Australia has is, because our standard of care is essentially the same as the US, and ultimately all companies want to be in the US market, then running initial trials in Australia then allows them to extend to phase 2, phase 3 quite easily. That's not true in a country like New Zealand. So the attractiveness of New Zealand if you're looking for treatment-naive patients in a particular cohort. So slightly different advantage. So our system's not perfect, particularly for rare cancer patients who often have to pay huge out-of-pocket costs for treatment because they're not covered by Medicare or PBS. We have this traditional system where you conduct clinical trials in a specific disease cohort. You need enough patients to support that data for reimbursement. So unfortunately, that's very challenging for rare cancer patients. You've got rare cancer patients having to travel overseas to crowdfund or to make the difficult decision not to participate in clinical research because they don't want to affect the finances of their families. A recent Rare Cancers Australia report surveyed participants, and 60% of those responding spent more than $10,000 on cancer-related expenses, with 10% of them spending more than $100,000. So I think there's a big opportunity for Australia to do a little bit more for rare cancer patients. Australia is recognised as a global leader for clinical trials, especially early phase. Australians living with rare cancers face significant barriers when it comes to accessing trials. So with few or no treatment options, clinical trials often represent the best or only chance for these patients. I'm hosting 3 national roundtables that are exploring how Australia can do a little bit better in this regard and deliver clinical trials that meet the needs of our rare cancer patients. So through presentations, roundtable discussions, breakout sessions, very similar to what we're doing at this conference, attendees will explore how trials are attracted and established, how patients are supported to identify and participate in them, and how to make best use of the data collected in trials to support that HTA and reimbursement process. So the primary outcome will be a white paper with actionable recommendations for our government's consideration. The health technology assessment is the structured evaluation of health technologies such as medicines to inform decisions about their use in healthcare, and it really considers clinical effectiveness, safety, cost effectiveness, implications on the budget, and social and ethical implications. The report on the left-hand side of this slide from September of last year made 50 recommendations for reform to Australia's HTA scheme, and that was designed to help address inequities in access, improve timely access to medicines, improve engagement, and invest in health technology assessment capability that really makes it adaptable and future-proof. Some of the specific areas identified for improvement in Australia's current HTA processes through this review included health technologies not being funded in the shortest possible time. Delays are often due to economic evaluation being used as a proxy for negotiation of the prices paid, and that our HTA pathways are too complex. And despite this review and the 50 recommendations, there's been limited reform to date. Medicines Australia, so again the pharmaceutical industry body, as late as last month was still publishing news items in relation to this. So I guess this again speaks to one of my earlier points about the importance of vocal industry bodies, coordinated approach to push reform through, even when reviews highlight what needs to be done. I did want to highlight a positive example though. So only 2 weeks ago, our Federal Health Minister announced that our Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee has backed listing both Opdivo and Yervoy, so 2 immunotherapies, on our PBS for a wider range of advanced and metastatic cancers, which will really benefit some rare cancer patients. So this is a big shift in our approach, where access to medicines is not reliant on impossible evidentiary standards for small patient populations. So that's a big step forward. And I think we heard yesterday that the FDA is doing something similar with 10 approved in the last month. So to finish, I wanted to touch on how the Australian clinical trial landscape continues to evolve. There's 4 items I wanted to discuss. So first is the Intergovernmental Policy Review Group, and then our National 10-Year Health and Medical Research Strategy, a national one-stop shop, and then the state of Victoria, where Melbourne is located, recently released a China strategy. So bear with me. Firstly, the Intergovernmental Policy Reform Group. So state-based delivery of healthcare is not ideal to attract international sponsors of clinical trials to work across state borders. You've got the same challenges here. This is the key forum to ensure state-based buy-in for national initiatives in the health space. So the IGPRG was established in 2023. It consists of a federally appointed independent chair and then representation of each of the state governments. They've got some key priorities listed here. So establishing a one-stop shop that I'll come back to in a moment, developing quality standards and an accreditation scheme for HRECs to ensure consistency across the country, supporting health services in implementing the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework that I discussed earlier, maintaining the SOPs that I discussed earlier, and developing and implementing any future reform initiatives to help improve our health and medical research ecosystem. But a key objective here is to keep Australia a preferred destination for medical research, including clinical trials. Clinical trials are focus area number 2 in our federal government's 10-year health and medical research strategy. So the overarching goal with this focus area to reform regulation and systems, as well as support networks to enable more equitable access to clinical trials, to implement the national one-stop shop that I'll come back to on the next slide, to roll out the accreditation scheme for HRECs, and to invest in rural, regional and remote clinical trial infrastructure, again to help minimise inequity across Australia. The one-stop shop is our federal government's most ambitious project. It's essentially an IT platform that will allow submissions nationally. So even though we currently have national mutual acceptance of ethics, you could submit to one ethics committee in one state and achieve approval for all hospitals across the country. The IT systems that are used for that approval differ between states. It's not consistent. So this will be a single platform for the entire country. The overarching objectives really are to replace those existing state-based submission systems, which will reduce some duplication, but secondly, to help improve awareness of clinical trials. And again, this was something that was discussed yesterday. We don't have a national platform. I can't tell you what are all the trials open in Australia right now. That's still very much a state-based approach. Having a national system will mean we can have a single website that any participant, any clinician can go to and see what trials are open where at any given point in time. So a build's likely to start next year. Detailed sector consultation's been running for 2 years, given the scale of the program. So finally, the Victorian state government recently released a China strategy. It was about 6 weeks ago. So China now starts more clinical trials than any other country in the world. However, about 80% of those trials are only run within in China. I expect that's going to change in the very near future. About 10% of the clinical trials my team supports come from a Chinese company. We've been working with Chinese companies for about 10 years. I think that any strategy to grow clinical trials in Canada has to really consider what's going on in the global landscape, whether China's a country that you want to work with, which countries are going to be leading clinical trials going forward, and really consider that as part of your strategy. So I'll end there. Just to summarise, it's really taken 30 years of hard work by many people to ensure Australia has one of the most attractive clinical trial ecosystems in the world, especially for early phase trials. I mentioned speed, quality and cost really as the 3 key components for that system. Unfortunately, you need all 3. If you've got 2 out of 3, it's not going to be good enough. Collaboration and international promotion are essential. Again, if you don't collaborate effectively and don't promote your capabilities internationally, no one will know about them. And the Australian clinical trial ecosystem really has to continue to evolve. So we've talked about the two main reasons you want to bring clinical trials into your country, the first being access to new therapies for patients, and the second being the investment that comes with that. Many countries have realised this and are looking to attract such trials. So if you don't continue to evolve, you're going to get left behind. Thank you for your time. I'll try and address any questions you might have.
Please, we welcome everyone to step up to the mic. Yes, Andreas.
Thanks, that was a terrific talk. Two quick questions. What's your budget and where does the money come from? And then second is, you're the head of cancer trials in Australia.
Yep.
Is there equivalent of like autoimmune disease Australia with MS, or are you the only such organization?
So budget for Cancer Trials Australia?
Yes.
And where it comes from. So we are funded through service provision to the hospitals. So the hospitals outsource services that they're responsible for to us. So preparation of ethics documentation, for example, negotiation of budget and contracts on their behalf, and so on. So our budget's about $10 million per year. It's all funded through service provision. We occasionally attract government grants if there are additional projects we'd like to do on the side to benefit the whole ecosystem. Your second question, look, there are other smaller initiatives. I think it's safe to say about 70% of all clinical trials run in Australia are cancer. So it's a very high percentage. There's a neuroscience-focused entity. There are 60 cooperative groups across the country that focus in different disease-specific areas. They don't provide the same services that we provide. They're nowhere near as large, but there are definitely disease-coordinated specific groups. Yeah.
G'day.
G'day.
So before starting, I'll just disclose a full positive bias for Australia. Graduated for both my undergrad and postgraduate studies from Australia. So I'll start first with some kudos, and then after a question.
You look like you've got a long list.
Yeah. So first, you've mentioned that every strategy must consider what's happening globally, recognizing the global aspect of our ecosystem and knowing what's happening out there and making sure that we remain competitive in the global scene, not only domestically, as you've highlighted some of the states' dynamics.
Yeah.
Global is still the target in terms of competitiveness. You've mentioned a culture of not considering clinical trials experimental, which is I think, critical. A lot of patient advocacy groups are allowed to talk that way, considering clinical trial as a treatment option, which is not necessarily the case for the healthcare system so much. So recognizing this, I think, is a key differentiator in your Australian ecosystem. You've been showing drug spendings, including rebates, which also shows the importance of partnerships with industry and full disclosure and transparency for better public and private buy-in. So kudos again to you. And your health and medical strategy is 10-year long, which goes beyond the electoral cycle.
Yes.
So you can really aim at long-term gains in terms of improving the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So kudos to that. I think we can all learn from what you guys are doing in Australia. One thing you've mentioned in your slides, in your challenge area, is you said that Australia is too slow in drug approval. And you're not that slow. Currently, in terms of days between the first launch to public reimbursement, Australia is 6th with out of the 20 OECD countries with 240 days. You guys are considering that slow. Just to let you know, Canada is 732 days.
I heard yesterday.
19 out of 20.
Yeah.
That's slow.
Speed is definitely relative. Yeah.
So, talking about speed, kudos to Oscar Piastri and Mark Webber, who wasn't on your slide. I think he's an Aussie jewel as well that would have deserved a spot. But going back to access, It has been mentioned as a key success factor that your standard of cares are really closely related to those in the US, which means access to standard of care that are best in practice is recognized as a key success factor for a clinical trial ecosystem. How much importance does that play in the equation of making sure that Australia is seen as a competitive destination for clinical trials investment, but also innovative therapies as a first-tier country?
I think it's critical. Otherwise, the protocols are going to differ too much between what would be undertaken in Australia and what type of patients you might recruit and what has to happen in subsequent studies that involve other countries. So if your standard of care in a specific cancer lags behind the US, that will definitely make you less attractive for many trials.
What would you say to any of your colleagues in other countries that wouldn't consider that a key success factor? What will be the killer argument you would bring in the conversation to say, hey guys, that's kind of critical here?
Why is it critical?
Yeah,
is that your question?
Convince those who doubt it is.
Well, I think most biotechs and pharma want to ultimately be selling their products in the US market. So at some point they need to be running at least latter phase trials in the US. And if you want to attract early phase trials, which is what Australia is focused on, because it leads to participation in later phase trials and it suits us better as a smaller country, then you need to have standard of care that is very similar to the US for that reason. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Thanks for all the kudos. And
Hi, Kurt. Thanks.
hey,
Thanks, Kurt. It's really enlightening. I had a specific question about the. I was just squatting. You know, sorry. It's going to have to go down for someone else. The accreditation process at the institutions. Can you speak a little bit to that process? What's involved? You said every 4 years.
it's every 3 years.
Every 3 years.
Yep.
And if to your awareness anyway, what was involved in implementing that? I would imagine that would be a bit like herding cats, but in terms of getting buy-in. Do you have any insights into that?
Well, definitely it was a consultation process to determine what accreditation was going to look like.
Right.
Essentially, it's a site visit and going through a bunch of criteria focused on safety and quality. So our hospitals have gone through that process for many years on a 3-year cycle, and just clinical trial units were never considered as part of that. I think hospitals here probably go through an accreditation process as well. Really, the change back in 2022 was to consider clinical trial units as part of that process and to develop specific criteria for that assessment.
Right.
But ultimately, it's a couple of assessors coming, spending time at the sites. I've not been directly involved, but I've been on some calls with them. They certainly like to speak to participants trials. They speak to CROs and other companies engaging. So I've had a few calls with them to discuss our relationship with the hospital as part of an accreditation process. So it's quite wide-ranging. All the criteria are listed on the website. You will find
So sort of looking at our probably the similarities in our systems, our cancer centers vary in size and
Yes.
capacity.
Yes.
So there would be a minimum standard, and that would be, I presume, if you could speak to it, probably an equitable or equitably achievable standard for all centers.
I think that's true. So the way it's represented is as a maturity scale. So it's not an all or nothing, and your trial unit's going to shut down if you don't have this list of criteria at this
Right.
point in time. But really what it's helped do is ensure the trial unit managers can go and advocate for what they require, which really they should require anyway, but now they have a system in place that says they require these things, so they can go and advocate for funding to implement those items.
And importantly, it's on the radar of the institutional leads.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you so much for your talk, Kurt. I remember being in Australia, I think it was in 2015 for an ACTA conference, and it's just phenomenal how Australia has grown in terms of clinical trials since then. So congratulations to all of you. It's a wonderful country. However, I wish that could decline, and not for the reasons you might think. I work with Clinical Trials Ontario, and of course, we're all looking for more clinical trials activity. However, my daughter and my grandson, Koopa, live in Perth, and I'd like them to come home. So if you could make
Yeah.
your country a little less wonderful, that would be super helpful to me.
Do they work in this space?
No, they don't work in this space, but it's a beautiful country. Anyway, my question is around the ethics review and the states having separate systems, and now it's coming into one system. So my question would be, what prompted that, and how quickly do you think it will happen?
Yeah, that's quite a loaded question. Is this recording getting published? It is getting published. Okay. What?
Kurt, there's always a thing called a break.
Yeah.
Where
What
we
prompted that? So time frame is harder to announce. This concept of a national one-stop shop was announced more than 15 years ago by a former federal health minister. And it's gone through a few changes of government. It's evolved. What was initially envisaged is not necessarily what it became. And I think over the last year, it's probably reverted back to closer to what it was, which is this IT platform for the country, and quite a focus on ensuring it is well understood what trials are open, where and when. In terms of time frame, the $13.6 million that I said they received a few weeks or months ago is really just to extend the consultation. They need $500 million, and they are hoping that will be announced in our federal budget in May next year. And then the build starts, and it's a year or two to build the platform, to roll it out, org change piece and training and so on. So it's a big project. What prompted it? I'm not actually sure what caused the initial announcement, but clearly what prompted it has to do with ensuring Australia remains attractive for clinical trials, and has to ensure patients can find out what trials are open where. The federally appointed independent chair was the former chief scientist of Australia, and he underwent cancer diagnosis and went through a cancer clinical trial. And he lived in a somewhat regional centre, a couple of hours out of Sydney, and he really struggled to find information. Even with his sort of scientific knowledge, he struggled to find information about what trials are open and where. So they've certainly appointed a strong advocate to drive this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You can tell me more at break,
Yeah,
okay?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Answer part A differently later.
Kurt, I know I speak on behalf of colorectal cancer and the entire audience. We're very grateful that you made the travels in person to be here. We, for months, have been getting a lot of news about your arrival, and many people have arrived here to see you specifically. Thank you for spending the time with us for the full 2 days and for sharing. I think you're going to need your business cards now to share with a whole lot of people.
Yeah, look, thanks for having me. Happy to answer more questions. My contact details are on the final slide as well. If you've got more questions later that you reflect on and you want to send me an email or set up a time for a virtual call, happy to chat.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Before we break, we're just going to do another polling question. Question number 8, my friends. How do we increase Canada as a global competitor in clinical trials? How do we attract more studies and investments from around the world? Just a couple of words on the slides. Then we're going to take a break for 10 minutes and come on back. Better tax incentives. National vision, this came up a lot yesterday. Present as one united entity, also a very strong theme. Speed. Long-term national vision. A lot of good reinforcement from many of the conversations yesterday. Thank you so much, everyone.